Hey everybody, it's Kendall from the Recording Lounge podcast again, doing a follow-up video to my previous video, Mixing for Loudness. If you haven't watched that, go check it out now. It'll make a lot more sense. But basically, we're going to do some more experiments and tests with saturation and compression. Now, I get a lot of questions about, trying to make someone's mix. Like, podcast listeners will email me and say, it just sounds really digital. My mix sounds really digital. I'm trying to, get this and that. And then they have other problems with loudness and they can't get their mix loud. And it's a domino effect, right? And you end up with a mix that doesn't sound cohesive or gelled. And people blame digital and they say, digital, it'd be so much better if it was on an analog console. Well, I'd like to clear up some of those myths. And the fact is, you can get results that very, very much rival analog consoles in the box. And a lot of it has to do with how you use the saturation rather than what saturation plugin you use. Most of them are great these days, okay? They're really nice sounding. Now, sure, there are some that I don't like, that I don't think sound good, but a lot of them these days are really amazing. Stuff from UBK and from Slate and there's just so many. I love the Sound Toys Decapitator also. So the key here is we're gonna listen to these different drum processing files where we have our raw drums and we've processed them in different ways with compression and some with saturation. We're going to compare and contrast some of them and see kind of what the difference is between them. And then later we're going to do some tests to see on paper how loud they all are. Now, with all of these files, I've normalized them to where they're all peaking at -3 dBFS. So these all have the same peak level. And if you watch my last video, you'll remember me saying the peak level is not a good indicator of loudness. That's why we use RMS level or LUFS, depending on how you like it. But peak level is what's going to trigger compressors and limiters and things like that. So it is still important in a way, because if you have a really unruly peak that pops over the threshold of a compressor, it's going to tell that compressor, hey, compress because I'm over the threshold. So one of the reasons, like I said, it's a domino effect. If you have really pokey transients, that's going to trigger compressors almost sort of prematurely as compared to what you would experience mixing on an analog console with analog gear. So let's first listen to our raw drums. This is the same example we used in our last video. Okay, now the first thing we're going to compare it to is 8 dB of compression, okay? 8 dB of compression on the drum bus. Okay, so that's quite a bit of compression, but it still sounds good. It's still nice and punchy. Now, this is a separate file that is a duplicate of the original that we used 4 compressors in series, each compressing 2 dB. Now, we're going to go back and compare these side by side after we listen to this, but this is an argument I made in my last video that said, generally speaking, if you do things in small stages, small amounts and multiple stages, it can sound better, more natural, while at the same time being a tiny bit louder. Let's compare a different section here, back and forth. Both of these are compressing 8 dB, but one is all in one set, and the other is in 4 different stages. So here we go. 8 dB. And the 4 compressors. Eight dB. And the 4. Back to 8, and the 4. So hopefully heard the use of 4 compressors, each compressing 2 dB, just by example, is just a tiny bit louder, but it also seems to have a little bit more pop on the kick and snare, a little bit more of that original pop, and sounds a little bit more natural, just a little bit. So I'll compare it one more time. It also sounds a little bit less pumpy than the 8 dB, in one shot version. The next thing I want to compare is this. We have two files. One was compressed 10 dB at 80% wet, and the other was compressed 16 dB at 50% wet. So this is an interesting parallel compression test. And if you haven't watched some of my videos on parallel compression, I urge you to do so. I do a lot of other tests with parallel compression to prove the point. So here's 10 dB at 80% wet. And 16 dB. $10. $16. So what's interesting here is that the 16 dB at 50% wet actually sounds a little bit quieter. You would your brain might think, oh, well, you're compressing more. I'm bringing up that RMS level, but because we have a lower mix on the parallel compression, you're blending in more of those original uncompressed transients. Now I want to compare the raw drums versus saturation only. No compression, just light saturation. And again, these are both peaking at -3 dBFS. They are the same level on a peak meter. So here's our raw drums. And our saturation. Raw drums. Saturation. So clearly the saturated one is much louder. If we reduce this level down to an area that they're more level matched by ear, just to say these are about the same loudness, it's pretty amazing. I'm comparing them back and forth. Again, the saturated one doesn't sound like distortion, okay? That's a common myth that, people don't want to use saturation plugins because they don't want their mix to be, like, distorted. But saturation is very subtle if used properly, and that's, to me, how it's supposed to be used properly because, a good analog compressor doesn't just distort everything that goes in it unless you push it really, really hard. The saturation is subtle, but it adds up in multiple stages. So I had to reduce the level of these drums by 6 dB to sound pretty close to the ear, which means that this is, essentially 6 dB louder on average. Now, we're going to see the actual numbers here in a little bit, but, it's really interesting that you can get that so much louder with such a subtle amount of saturation. Now, I want to compare that to using light saturation and lighter compression, 4 dB of compression. Notice how much those snare hits and kick hits are pushed back on the one with compression. So that's a good comparison to show you the difference between, just saturating versus saturating and then compressing. And again, I could have compressed this a little bit lighter because the saturation actually helps even out these peaks. So we're going to do some additional tests and see how loud these are actually metering and what that actually means. Okay, so as we're looking at our screenshot of our different levels that we tested on all of these individual drum files, you can see we have all the tracks are peaking at -3 dBFS, give or take some left and right differences. Where there's a floor tom on the right side that might hit a little bit louder or whatever. But you can see that we used RMS level, we have peak level, and we also have loofs. Now, loofs is loudness units relative to a full scale. And essentially, that was sort of some people believe, and I do to some degree, that that's a more accurate, sort of almost like a more accurate version of RMS or average level or of loudness. It gives us maybe a little bit better level reading for how loud something really is. Now, again, we listened to all of these, and we certainly had, some of them sounded louder to us than others. So we're going to talk about that. You can see that our raw drums have an RMS of negative 24.4. As we compress, we actually get a lower RMS, and that's partly because when you compress something at a certain speed of attack and release and ratio and all those things combined, it actually will accentuate some of those peaks and make them snappier and punchier. And that's okay, but if the level differences, if you're trying to use compression to even out something, that's not necessarily the best approach. Now, if your drummer plays very evenly, or if you've already saturated your drums a little bit, or you're not having the problem of things being overly peaky or poking out at you, then compression is probably a great choice. But again, I challenge you to use compression as a creative tool and as a tonal tool rather than trying to use compression to even out levels. It can even out levels a little bit more easy, a little easier on something like bass or vocals where you're not dealing with such pokey transients, whereas you might be, on drums. And this is one of the arguments that I've made in the past for why people prefer often to use drum samples as opposed to live drums. And one of the main reasons that I've found for that is because a lot of drum samples are very even in level and they don't trigger quite as sensitively as a real drummer could. And so to the ear, that naturally sounds better. Like, wow, it sounds amazing. But in reality, if you've ever heard a really good session drummer that can hit the snare the same volume every single time throughout the whole song, or the kick or the toms the same volume every single time, it's, like I said, it's kind of a revelation because you're sitting there saying, wow, I don't have to worry about evenness. And that's one factor because, when you're dealing with drums, you're almost dealing with the evenness factor, but you're also dealing with the punchiness factor. And if you're trying to get the drums more even, which I recommend that you do, then, I find that saturation is a much better tool for doing that. Now, again, after you compress and or saturate, you then need to kind of automate some of those dynamics back in because, yes, it will kind of make the dynamics a little more static, but that becomes a lot easier in the end to handle because it sounds better, it sounds consistent, it sounds like the drummer is really solid, whether it's live drums or not, and it sounds like it just sounds better. I can't describe it. But then you can use automation to bring your drums sort of up and down on drum fills and pull them down a little bit in the verse, maybe bring them up on a transition, pull them up when it's a quiet section of just cymbals, pull them back when it's really, going at it, or maybe push them when it's really going at it. That's up to you. That's what part of what makes you the individual mixer that you are. You can see that the level does get a little bit louder, almost a little closer, a whole dB louder in RMS as compared to 8 dB of compression by using compression in multiple stages. And this was the argument that I made in my other video, that generally speaking, compression in multiple stages not only can sound a little more natural. You'll remember when we did our side-by-side comparison, my personal take was that the multi-stage compression sounded a little bit snappier and it retained a little bit more of that punch. However, we can see here that not only did it sound a little bit more punchy, it was actually louder than the one that was compressed 8 dB, by a whole dB. Now, our 10 dB compression at 80% wet is a little bit quieter, and our 16 dB compression at 50% wet is a little bit quieter because, again, we're slowly blending in more of those original transients, combining with quite a bit of compression that may or may not accentuate some of the snap in those drums. Now, our saturation only, you can see, is the loudest for sure. And when you compare side by side the saturated versus the raw drums like we did, you can see that the saturation one doesn't sound distorted. It doesn't sound like we distorted the drums. It's very subtle, but it's, 5 dB louder to our ear, on average 5 dB louder. Now we look at our saturation plus 4 dB of compression. It's almost, it's just a touch louder than our original, but again, it sounds very natural. It sounds like, we compressed the original lightly. It almost sounds like our track of 4 compressors doing 2 dB each. So I hope that clears some things up. Now, in terms of loofs, you can also see the differences here. Our original versus 8 dB of compression versus the 4 compressors doing 2 dB each. We can see that it's louder again, just like here. Our 10 dB, 16 dB, 50% wet, our saturation only, and our light saturation plus compression. You can see the differences are, they're pretty similar across the board to the RMS level, but I just wanted to include that if you prefer to see the Louf's measurement. Okay, so I hope you guys found that interesting and informative. I just want to reiterate that if you want your mixes to sound more glued and more gelled and, quote, more like it was done on an analog console, you need to start thinking ahead and think from step one, from what mic you choose into what preamp you choose, into the, if you got any outboard gear. I've got a nice rack full of EQs and compressors that I use all the time, but if you don't have any, then you're going to have to think about that in the mix. You have to think about it in the order like you might plug in gear. So let's say on these raw drums, if we wanted this to be our drum bus, for example, we might add a little bit of saturation using something like the UBK1. Okay, this might simulate a little bit of saturation from transformers or from mic pre's or from outboard gear, right? So we might just add a little bit of saturation there. Just enough to barely hear it even happening, okay? Then, if you don't have any outboard analog compressors, chances are in most of the sessions that of your favorite artists, there's probably going to be some compression on the way in, on drums or whatever, on vocals. That's just how it goes. I mean, if you've got it in a tracking space, you're probably going to use some of it because we like to commit. We like to get that sound quick, and we like to sort of tie our hands so that we say, like, I want a vocal that's in your face. Let's record it that way. So maybe, let's say you'd record some drums with a little bit of compression. Now, you probably would do it individually on, say, the kick channel and the snare channel, and maybe the room mics would have their own compression. But just for this example, I'm going to use a different compressor. I'm going to use one that a lot of us have. Let's say the CLA 76. Okay, so a lot of us have this compressor. We're just going to set this slow and fast and just lightly compress. Okay, just to kind of glue it all together. Now let's say, we're using, say, the Slate Virtual Console Collection. So this is to simulate almost like, okay, so we've recorded our drums through nice pre's and maybe a little bit of compression on the way in. Now it's being sent to the mixer, and he's going to use, an analog console. So let's say he's using an SSL style console, okay, Brit 4KE, and it's just going to be driving a little bit. He's probably going to gain stage it to 0, because that's how it's often done, is you gain stage it to 0 VU. Maybe somewhere around there, okay? Now let's say it was mixed to a 2-track machine. This has a bit of a bump down low, so I'm going to actually turn that down a little bit. As you heard, in any of those stages, I wasn't adding anything that sounded crazy obvious, like, oh no, you're distorting the drums. I mean, sure, a little bit of crunch here and there, a little bit of saturation, tiny bit of compression, but just subtle bits of saturation. And this could be used to simulate more of an analog chain, because a lot of people will use virtual mix rack or whatever, but they don't consider the recording side of it, is that sometimes you have to include that as well. And again, this could be done on individual channels even more subtly. So you could even do less if you were doing it on the kick, snare, toms, overheads, whatever, individually. I find that I often will saturate my overheads because they can get very, very peaky and articulate, and then maybe my kick and snare kick just a little bit. I like a pretty clear, clean kick, but I can saturate my snare a little bit more. That's kind of the beautiful thing about working in the box, is that you can choose to saturate things how much you want. Then I might add a tiny bit of saturation on the drum bus, then a compressor. On my master bus, I might put virtual tape machines. But at the same time, I might not. I might want my mix to be a little bit cleaner. What we're going to do to compare these is render this in place using Nuendo's render in place function. So what that's going to do is going to write this file and pull it right below. And then next, what we're going to do is level match these to peak level. So what we see here is that this saturated one, the one that with the processed plugins on it, is 6 dB quieter peak level than our original. So if we boost this up now 6 dB, it's even a little bit more, but if we boost this up 6 dB, we can compare now the difference in loudness. So this is our raw drums and our processed drums. Okay, much, much louder. So if I, again, level match these down by ear, that sounds about, a pretty similar level to my ear. Look how much lower I had to turn it down. On top of that 6 dB difference, I had to turn it down 7 dB. I hear a lot of guys over-compressing stuff and over-compressing their mixes, and the real part of the equation that they're missing is saturation. And that's and looking at it from multiple subtle stages, just like it would be in a real analog situation where you have people using analog gear to track and then sent to a separate person to mix on an analog console with analog gear in the mix, and then sent to a mastering guy who's probably going to be using analog gear. But the point is, you as the mixer and the engineer have to work with this in mind. You have to work knowing that that is part of the process these days. And if you want things to sound a little bit more like it was done on a console or in an analog studio, you're going to have to use your box, work in the box and think about it like you're out of the box. All right, so thanks for watching this video. I hope it's taught you some things about saturation and mixing and compression and mixing for loudness. As always, send me your questions or comments or show suggestions to recordingloungepodcast@gmail.com. I appreciate all the comments and questions so far, and check out the podcast on your favorite podcast app or website. Thanks for listening.